September 21st, 1945. A repatriation processing center in Manila. The tropical night air is thick with humidity and the distant sound of generators. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead in temporary barracks that smell of fresh lumber and institutional soap. Rows of metal frame beds line the walls, each made up with crisp white sheets and pillows. Hana Yamamoto hesitates at the doorway. She's 28 years old. Former civilian nurse, 3 years in a Japanese labor camp in the Philippines, 73 pounds. When the Americans arrived 2 weeks ago, she's wearing a donated dress that hangs loose on her frame, clutching a small bundle of personal items. An American nurse gestures to one of the beds. "That's yours," she says in broken Japanese. "For tonight, until we can process you for transport home." Hana approaches the bed like it might disappear. She touches the mattress with one finger, then her whole hand. Then she presses down, and the mattress gives way softly, springily, impossibly. She pulls her hand back, as if burned. "This can't be for me," she thinks. "This is too soft, too clean. Too... much. This must be a mistake." What she doesn't know is that this moment, this first contact with a bed softer than anything she has touched in years will force her to confront the complete asymmetry between how prisoners were treated and how even temporary American accommodations were furnished. That something as simple as mattress softness will become evidence of abundance so profound it's almost obscene. Those words were about to become inadequate for describing what's happening in her mind, because within minutes, when she finally lies down on that bed, years of sleeping on wooden boards and concrete floors will collide with the reality of foam padding and springs, and she'll understand, in her body before her mind can process it, just how much she'd been asked to endure, just how unnecessary that endurance had been. For 14 days, Hana had been in American custody. The liberation had been sudden American forces arriving at the camp where she'd been held, the Japanese guards fleeing or surrendering the prisoners, too weak and stunned to celebrate properly. She'd expected execution or abandonment. She'd found medical care, food, and the slow, careful process of being nursed back to something resembling health. The Americans had set up processing centers for the thousands of displaced persons flooding toward Allied lines Japanese civilians who'd been caught on the wrong side of the war, prisoners of various nationalities, refugees from the devastation. It was organized chaos, bureaucratic but humane. Nothing like the brutal efficiency of Japanese military operations. Hana had been assigned to a women's barracks, given clean clothes, fed meals that seemed impossibly abundant, vegetables, even meat. She'd been examined by doctors, her various ailments catalogued and treated. She'd been issued documents, told she'd be repatriated to Japan once shipping became available. She'd processed all of this with a kind of numb confusion. The Americans weren't cruel. They weren't even particularly kind. They were just professional, efficient, treating her as a logistical challenge to be solved rather than as an enemy to be punished or a victim to be pitied. But now, standing in front of this bed with its impossible softness, something is shifting. Because beds reveal priorities. They reveal what a society thinks people deserve. They reveal the difference between survival and comfort, between minimal accommodation and actual care. And this bed, this American military-issue temporary barracks bed that probably cost almost nothing by American standards, was more comfortable than any bed Hana had slept in for 3 years. More comfortable than what she'd had as a nurse before the war. More comfortable than what she'd ever expected to have again. Across the Pacific, in dozens of similar facilities from Okinawa to Singapore, from Burma to the Philippines, the same scene was unfolding. Female prisoners, Japanese civilians, comfort women, nurses, teachers, anyone caught in the war's chaos being processed through American facilities. And all of them were encountering beds, real beds, soft beds, beds that made them question everything they'd been taught about necessary hardship and reasonable accommodation. How did something as mundane as mattress softness become one of the most psychologically disorienting aspects of American custody? How did beds expose the profound differences between Japanese and American approaches to prisoner welfare? And why did the experience of sleeping comfortably for the first time in years force these women to confront uncomfortable truths about suffering, endurance, and what had been asked of them? The answer lies in the hidden history of how both nations understood comfort, necessity, and what human beings required to maintain dignity and health. To understand Hana's shock, we must go back to 1942, when Japan's philosophy of hardship as virtue became institutionalized in every aspect of civilian and military life. Japanese military culture had long emphasized endurance, sacrifice, acceptance of hardship as character building, the concept of geimon. Enduring the unbearable with patience and dignity was central to Japanese identity. When wartime, this cultural value was weaponized, soldiers were expected to endure starvation, disease, brutal conditions without complaint, and if soldiers were expected to endure, civilians certainly had no right to comfort. Hana had trained as a nurse in the late 1930s. Even then, before war, Japanese medical facilities had been Spartan. Hospitals had hard beds, minimal padding, the philosophy being that comfort was unnecessary for healing and might even be counterproductive, making patients soft, delaying their return to duty. When she'd been assigned to a hospital in Manila in 1940, she'd found the beds adequate, hard wooden platforms with thin mattresses, but clean, functional. She'd never questioned whether they could be better. This was what beds were, what they'd always been, what they were supposed to be. Then the war came, and even that minimal comfort disappeared. As resources became scarce, as Japan's position deteriorated, the philosophy of endurance was intensified. Prisoners of all kinds, military, civilian, anyone under Japanese authority were given the bare minimum for survival, often less than minimum. Wooden boards to sleep on, concrete floors, sometimes just ground. It wasn't just cruelty, though cruelty existed. It was philosophy, that hardship built character, that comfort weakened resolve, that endurance was itself a form of resistance and virtue. Japanese prisoners were expected to survive on nothing because that's what strong people did. They endured. What Japanese authorities didn't know was that America had developed a completely different philosophy about prisoner welfare and human accommodation. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had signed but never ratified, established minimum standards for POW treatment. But America, in its typical way, had exceeded minimums. The U.S. military, drawing on progressive era reform movements and industrial efficiency studies, had concluded that maintaining prisoner health and morale was actually strategically valuable, that well-treated prisoners were less likely to escape, more likely to provide useful intelligence, more valuable for eventual prisoner exchanges. But there was something deeper. American culture, for all its flaws and contradictions, had developed a baseline assumption that people have been prisoners. Even enemies deserved a certain minimum of comfort. That denying basic comfort wasn't just cruel, it was inefficient, counterproductive, beneath the dignity of a civilized nation. This philosophy extended to mattresses. The U.S. military had studied sleep, had concluded that well-rested soldiers performed better, that proper bedding prevented illness, that the cost of decent mattresses was offset by reduced medical expenses and improved morale. So even temporary barracks, even processing centers, even facilities for prisoners and displaced persons got real mattresses, not luxury items, military-issue foam and springs, utilitarian but adequate, but soft, supportive, actually designed for human comfort. The contrast with Japanese philosophy was absolute. And that contrast was about to become physically, viscerally apparent to every prisoner who touched an American bed. American military bedding specifications, established in 1943, required mattresses of at least 4 inches of padding, with springs or foam construction, covered with waterproof ticking, replaced or refurbished every 2 years. The specifications existed because American military planners had determined that sleep quality affected everything else. This wasn't sentimentality. It was calculated efficiency. But the effect was revolutionary for anyone who'd endured Japanese custody. And then, on September 21st, 1945, Hana Yamamoto sat down on an American bed and felt softness she'd forgotten existed. Hana sits. The mattress compresses beneath her. Not hard, not punishing. Just ... giving. Supporting. Welcoming her weight, instead of resisting it. She hasn't cried since the first week of captivity, crying wastes. Water shows weakness, accomplishes nothing. But now, sitting on this too soft bed, she starts crying. Not from grief, from the sudden, overwhelming understanding of how much pain she's been in. How much her body is hurt. How many nights she's woken with aching bones and stiff joints from sleeping on boards. The bed is teaching her body something her mind had processed. That the suffering had been extreme, that normal human accommodation was different from what she'd endured, that this softness wasn't luxury, it was just basic humanity. She'd been taught that endurance was virtue, that complaining about physical hardship showed weak character, that strong people adapted to harsh conditions without needing comfort. Now she's learning that maybe strength isn't about enduring unnecessary suffering. Maybe it's about recognizing when suffering is unnecessary. The American nurse who'd shown her the bed returns, sees her crying. "Are you okay?" she asks. In English, Hannah doesn't understand the words but recognizes the concern in the tone. She tries to explain in Japanese. "The bed, it's so soft. I'd forgotten what soft felt like." The nurse doesn't understand the Japanese words either, but she sits beside Hannah, sits on the bed with her, making the mattress. Compress, further demonstrating that it's okay to use it, to let it support you, to accept comfort without guilt. This small gesture, an American nurse sitting on the bed to show it's okay to become more revolutionary than any political speech. It's teaching through action that comfort isn't weakness. That humans deserve support, literally and metaphorically. They expected punishment, or at best, minimal survival conditions. They found beds designed for human comfort, provided as standard protocol, treated as basic minimum rather than luxury. They had been told that American materialism made them weak and decadent. The truth was American abundance allowed them to treat even prisoners with a baseline of dignity that Japanese philosophy had rejected as unnecessary softness. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across every facility where female prisoners were being processed, the beds were having the same effect. Women who endured years of sleeping on hard surfaces were encountering softness and having their understanding of necessary suffering shattered. In Okinawa, Kako Tanako, Tichira, who'd been imprisoned for having American missionary connections, lay down on a bed in the women's processing center and couldn't sleep. The softness felt wrong, excessive, like she was stealing something she didn't deserve. She spent the first night on the floor beside the bed, unable to accept comfort she'd been taught was inappropriate for prisoners. The second night, her body aching from the hard floor, she tried the bed again. This time, she stayed and cried herself to sleep in the softest place she'd been in for years, in Singapore. Mikiko Satoa, former comfort woman who'd been trafficked from Korea, touched the mattress and thought it was a trick, that the Americans would let her get comfortable and then take it away, teach her not to expect kindness. But the bed remained, night after night, and slowly, she started believing that maybe she deserved to sleep without pain. These weren't just beds. They were arguments, physical proof that suffering could be reduced, that comfort was achievable, that the hardship they'd endured was inevitable but chosen by a system that valued endurance over well-being. To understand the full impact, we need to understand the infrastructure that made these soft beds possible and what that infrastructure revealed about American priorities and productive capacity. While Japan had been converting every industrial resource to weapons production, sacrificing civilian comfort completely, America had maintained domestic manufacturing of consumer goods, including bedding. The U.S. military had contracts with mattress manufacturers. There were supply chains specifically for bedding, warehouses full of mattresses, logistic systems for distributing them to every facility. The scale was staggering. The U.S. military procurement system had ordered approximately 20 million mattresses between 1941 and 1945 for soldiers, for military bases, for hospitals, for temporary facilities, for prisoner processing centers. 20 million mattresses. More than the entire Japanese population. This wasn't because Americans were soft or decadent. It was because American industrial capacity was so vast that it could produce both weapons and comfort items simultaneously. The same factories that made mattresses for military use continued making them for civilian use, scaled up production, and still had capacity for export. The comparison was damning. Japan had asked its people to sleep on boards while devoting every resource to weapons. America had produced more weapons than Japan while also ensuring its people and even its prisoners slept comfortably. Most surprising were the medical justifications in American military documents. Reports from 1943 showed that proper bedding reduced illness, improved recovery times, lowered medical costs, and improved morale. The mattresses weren't kindness, they were efficiency. But the effect was the same. People sleeping in American custody were more comfortable than people sleeping under Japanese authority, including Japanese civilians in Japan itself. The system revealed something fundamental, that America's productive capacity was so overwhelming that it could afford humanity without sacrificing military effectiveness, that abundance and victory were connected, that taking care of people, even enemy people, was possible when you weren't operating from scarcity. For the women experiencing this, the revelation was devastating, because it meant their suffering had been avoidable. That Japan had chosen the philosophy of hardship not from necessity, but from ideology. That they'd been asked to endure not because endurance was required, but because their government valued it. 6 months ago, Hana had been sleeping on boards in a prison camp, telling herself that endurance built character, that comfort was unnecessary, that strong people adapted to harsh conditions. She'd truly believed that the Americans, if they captured her, would treat her worse than the Japanese had treated her. That enemy custody meant death or torture. Now she's lying on a mattress softer than any she'd slept on before the war, in enemy custody, being treated with more concern for her physical well-being than her own government had shown. She's facing an impossible choice. She can maintain the Japanese philosophy of endurance, and sacrifice was noble. That comfort is weakness, that she should reject this softness as corrupting. Or she can accept that her body's relief, her bones, gratitude for support, her exhausted muscles' response to proper rest at. These are telling her something true about what humans need and deserve. The bed won't let her maintain the first position. Her body is making the choice for her. Every night she sleeps better. Every morning she wakes with less pain. The evidence is undeniable because it's physical, because it's happening in her own flesh. After a week on the soft bed, Hana tries to remember what the hard boards felt like. Sekant. Her body has already adapted to softness, already accepted it as normal. The adjustment happened faster than she expected, and that speed is itself revealing humans aren't meant for constant hardship. We adapt to it, but we adapt to comfort faster, because comfort is more natural to our bodies. One night, she's talking with other women in the barracks. They're all processing the same confusion. I feel guilty, one woman says, for sleeping so well, while our families at home are still suffering. But why should we suffer too? Another asks. How does our pain help them? It's the question that breaks everything open, because none of them have a good answer. The philosophy of endurance had never explained how individual suffering helped collective victory. It had just asserted that it did, and they'd accepted it. But this knowledge came with a price that Hana was only beginning to understand. She couldn't unknow her body's response to comfort, couldn't return to believing that hardship was virtue. Couldn't maintain that endurance for its own sake was noble when she understood viscerally that unnecessary suffering was just unnecessary. She'd gained comfort, but she'd lost the consolation of believing her suffering had been meaningful. This pattern was spreading across multiple facilities, creating variations on the same theme of physical revelation and psychological reckoning. In Tokyo, at a facility for repatriating Japanese nationals from Korea, Emiko Watanabe, a factory worker who'd been conscripted for war, production encountered soft beds in the American Rune Processing Center. She'd spent 2 years sleeping on factory dormitory bunks, with rice straw mattresses so thin they were basically decorative. The American mattress felt absurd, excessive, almost offensive in its comfort when she thought about friends still in Japan sleeping on nothing. But her back, damaged from factory work and hard sleeping surfaces, began to heal. She hadn't realized how much pain she'd been in until it started to diminish. My body is betraying my principles, she wrote in a diary that would later be archived. It wants comfort more than it wants consistency. Not everyone accepted the soft beds. In a facility in Burma, a group of former nurses who'd been prisoners together made a pact. They would sleep on the floors beside the beds, refusing American comfort as a matter of pride. They maintained this for 3 days before, one by one, Aching and exhausted, they gave in. The last holdout, a woman named Sachiko, finally climbed into her assigned bed on the fourth night. "I'm not weak," she told the others, "but maybe strength isn't about rejecting comfort. Maybe it's about surviving long enough to go home." For Yuki Taniguchi in Saigon, the price was different. She'd been a true believer in Japanese military philosophy, had volunteered for overseas service, had genuinely embraced the ideology of sacrifice and endurance. The soft bed confronted her with physical evidence that her ideology was flawed. She couldn't sleep on the soft mattress for weeks, not from pride, from genuine confusion. Her body wanted it. Her mind rejected it. The disconnect was paralyzing. She'd built her identity on being someone who didn't need comfort, who transcended physical weakness through spiritual strength. The bed was teaching her that transcendence was exhausting, that her body had needs, whether her ideology acknowledged them or not, that she'd been hurting herself for a philosophy that now seemed questionable. The ripples were spreading. These women would return to Japan eventually, carrying knowledge that Japanese civilians hadn't had. That abundance was possible. That comfort wasn't weakness. That other nations provided better for their people, including their prisoners, than Japan provided for its own citizens. The opposition to accepting American comfort came from predictable sources, but revealed deep anxieties about what acceptance meant. Some Japanese military officers in custody argued that accepting soft beds was surrender, not just militarily but culturally. That comfortable sleep was the first step toward accepting American values, American softness, American materialism. That maintaining Japanese identity required maintaining Japanese attitudes toward hardship. One officer at a processing facility in Manila gave a speech to the Japanese civilian women there. "They were trying to make you soft. Once you accept comfort, you'll forget your Japanese spirit. You'll become weak like them." But the women, sleeping on soft mattresses and waking without pain, weren't convinced. "If being weak means sleeping well," one responded, "then maybe weak is better than what we were." Among American personnel, there was some discomfort with how the beds were affecting prisoners. Some officers worried that providing too much comfort would be seen as rewarding Japan's aggression, that prisoners should be given minimums only. But military policy was clear. Geneva Convention standards at minimum, and in practice, normal military issue bedding. Treating prisoners poorly would make America look barbaric. Treating them according to standards made America look civilized, strong enough to be humane. The moment came when Hannah's processing was complete, and she was told she'd be shipped to Japan within days. She'd be leaving the soft bed behind, returning to a devastated country where beds of any kind were scarce, where she'd likely be sleeping on whatever surface she could find. The last night in the barracks, she lay on the mattress trying to memorize how it felt, trying to store the physical memory of softness so she could remember that it existed, that it was possible that humans could live this way. Other women were doing the same, knowing they were leaving, knowing they were returning to hardship, trying to hold on to the lesson the beds had taught, that suffering could be reduced, that comfort was achievable, that the world contained more possibilities than Japanese wartime ideology had admitted. "We'll forget," one woman said. "Back in Japan, we'll forget this was real. We'll think we imagined how soft these beds were. Then we'll remind each other," another said. "We'll remember that this existed, that it's possible, that maybe someday we can have it again." What no one had known was that these conversations were being documented. American occupation forces had researchers studying how Japanese civilians responded to American custody, trying to understand what worked for democratization efforts, what created receptiveness to change. The reports noted that physical comfort, particularly bedding, had profound psychological effects, that Japanese women who experienced soft beds were more likely to question wartime propaganda, more receptive to American explanations of democratic values, more willing to consider that Japanese military ideology had been flawed. The beds weren't intentional psychological warfare, but they functioned as such anyway. They were physical proof that abundance was possible, that American productive capacity was real, that the soft Americans had somehow built a society that could be both militarily powerful and physically comfortable. For Hannah, the victory was bittersweet. She'd discovered that life could be less painful, that comfort was achievable, but she was leaving it behind, returning to a destroyed country where such comfort would be impossible for years, maybe decades. She'd gained knowledge of what was possible, but she'd lost the ability to accept unnecessary suffering as virtuous. By October 1945, statistics told a story. Over 200,000 Japanese civilians had been processed through American facilities in the Pacific. Medical reports showed marked improvements in health during custody. People gained weight, chronic conditions improved, stress-related illnesses reduced. Much of this was attributed to adequate food and medical care. But reports also noted the impact of proper sleep on recovery. Remember Hana Yamamoto, who'd hesitated before touching that first soft bed? 3 years later, she was working as a nurse in Tokyo, in a hospital rebuilt with American aid. The beds there weren't as soft as the American ones had. Japan couldn't afford that yet, but they had mattresses, thin but real, provided through occupation programs. Hana advocated for better bedding for patients, arguing that recovery required rest, that rest required comfort, that comfort wasn't luxury but medical necessity. She'd learned this from her own body, from nights on that American mattress when her bones had finally stopped aching. What seemed like a simple provision of basic bedding would eventually contribute to post-war reforms in Japanese medical facilities, dormitories, schools. The Americans had demonstrated that mattresses were affordable, that comfort improved outcomes, that the Japanese philosophy of hardship has virtue had been counterproductive. The real heirs of this change were Japanese women of the next generation, who grew up with the gradual expectation that beds should be comfortable, that physical well-being mattered, that endurance for its own sake wasn't virtue. The shift to slow Japan remained more Spartan than America, but it was real. Today, Japanese mattress technology is world-leading. Japanese beds are considered among the most thoughtfully designed anywhere. Few users know that part of that evolution traces back to post-war woman War D experienced American bedding, and could you unforget that comfort was possible? September 21st, 1945. Hana Yamamoto, sitting on a bed too soft to believe, feeling her body respond to comfort she'd forgotten existed. That moment, 80 years ago, set in motion a complicated reckoning with suffering and what humans actually need versus what they can be taught to endure. This wasn't just about female posts being shocked by how soft American beds felt. It was about how physical experiences can shatter ideological beliefs, how bodies speak truths that minds try to deny, and how something as simple as a mattress can become evidence of completely different philosophies about human worth and societal priorities. Hana Yamamoto returned to nursing in rebuilt Tokyo. She worked until 1978. She never forgot those American beds, never stopped advocating for better patient bedding, never stopped arguing that physical comfort was medical necessity rather than luxury. In her last interview, conducted in 1992, she was asked what moment most changed how she understood the war. It wasn't seeing destruction or learning about atrocities or even the Emperor's surrender broadcast, she said. It was lying on a soft bed in American custody and physically understanding, in my bones, that everything we'd been taught about necessary suffering was a lie, that humans weren't meant to hurt constantly, that comfort wasn't weakness, that a society wealthy enough to give soft beds to prisoners was wealthy in ways WWII refused to acknowledge. That changed everything. The lesson wasn't just about mattresses or prisoner treatment or American abundance versus Japanese scarcity. It was that Bodis, remember what minds tried to forget. That physical experience can't be argued away with ideology. That when your bones stop aching for the first time in years, your body tells you a truth your mind can't deny. That suffering isn't always necessary, that endurance isn't always virtue, and that maybe humans deserve comfort, not as reward, but as baseline humanity. And that sometimes the most revolutionary thing isn't a speech or a policy. It's just a soft place to sleep, offered without condition, provided as standard, treating rest as a right rather than a privilege. One mattress at a time. One night of pain-free sleep at a time. One body learning it doesn't have to hurt at a time. That's how beliefs change. Not through argument, but through experience. Not through ideology, but through the undeniable testimony of bones that finally don't ache, of muscles that finally release tension, of a body that finally remembers what it feels like to be supported rather than punished. Hana kept a piece of fabric from one of those American mattresses, just a small square, torn from a corner before she left, kept in her possession through decades. She never explained to anyone why she kept it, but sometimes she'd touch it, feel the texture. Remember, that fabric square is now in a museum in Tokyo. Part of an exhibition on post-war occupation. Most visitors walk past without noticing just an old piece of mattress sticking, yellowed and worn. But if you know the story, it becomes something else. Evidence of the moment when suffering stopped being virtue, when comfort stopped being weakness, when a woman's aching body taught her something her training couldn't, that maybe we deserve to rest without pain. That maybe that's not weakness, that maybe that's just human.